Elizabeth Hargrave, the designer of the wildly successful Wingspan board game, created a presentation for industry representatives and board gamers entitled, "Oh My God, My Wife Wants to Play Your Game." This presentation sparked an ongoing discussion on the barriers faced by women enthusiasts and industry professionals. According to Hargrave's findings, women were significantly less likely to participate in online board game fan sites. For example, the top-rated games such as Scythe, only 9% of the participants on the Facebook fan page identify themselves as women. The game sites with the most participation among women were Wingspan and Pandemic, but that still saw less than 30% of the participants identifying as women. However, as only 18 of the top 50 games ranked on Board Game Geek have online Facebook pages, it might be argued that one cannot draw a definitive conclusion about these participation numbers. On the general interest board game group, such as Facebook, on Board Game Geek, the Board Game Group, the Board Game Revolution, all of its time, fans of Gen Con, Board Game Spotlight, Everything Board Game Community, the participation of women in these communities range from the lowest 20 to the highest at 35%. Hargrave also found that women failed to make more than 20% of the membership of most of the board game design and industry groups, such as Board Game Design Lab, Protosphere, the Unpub Network, Maple Syrup Talk Show, Board Game Reviewers, and Media Art and Graphical Design for tabletop games. Another board game designer did a similar analysis. Gil Hova, a board game designer and publisher, did a year-long research study to determine who he played games with at a variety of venues, including playtesting events to try new designs, in public venues such as cafes and conventions, and in private. Hova found that men made up 77% of his opponents over the course of an entire year. Slightly more women were his opponent in private spaces, with Hova recording he played with other men at 71%, which represented 137 games and 295 opponents. These kind of studies help us see, through a mirror darkly, an emerging picture that suggests that the participation of women, Black, Indigenous, persons of color, and other marginalized groups in board gaming might be constrained and limited. At minimum, these kinds of surveys and analyses demonstrate that identities that aren't white and male are clearly marginalized and not engaging with these polls, surveys, and fora. None of these findings mean that women and BIPOC individuals, Black, Indigenous, persons of color, are not active participants, nor does it mean that they aren't interested in game design, but their limited participation in these board gaming venues is very telling. What is really going on with these board game, online spaces, and gaming spaces in face-to-face venues? It's true that women, Black, Indigenous, persons of color, and other marginalized people aren't playing games. Is that the case, or are they simply avoiding engaging in these online fora and public gaming events? Women are increasingly becoming key consumers of digital games based on the digital game market analysis that we looked at earlier, proving that women do indeed like to game. But something, it would appear, is holding them back from board gaming based on this albeit imperfect evidence. Some commentators have suggested that board gaming can be unwelcoming if you're not a white man. Former Dice Tower contributors and founders of Salt and Sass board game reviews, Suzanne Sheldon and Mandy Hutchinson, shared that the lack of diversity and representation was pervasive throughout the hobby community, which is predominantly made up by white males. Hutchinson shared that she got into board game content creation because, quote, "I didn't see anyone who looked like me." Sheldon and Hutchinson have both reported being targets of online attacks on social media and have detailed their experiences of being targeted at gaming conventions for their critique of the board gaming community. Their voices, along with many other women, LGBTQ+, and BIPOC content creators, designers, commentators, and enthusiasts, have also called for board game publishers to include more representation of women and BIPOC individuals in both the production teams and in board game artwork. They've also called for the hobby to look for ways to welcome a broader demographic of players to gaming spaces. Hutchinson and Sheldon are not alone in their critiques of board gaming. In a Reddit post on our board games that generated 24,000 votes and nearly 3,600 comments, Redditor Abigaila wrote, quote, "There's a problem with how women are treated in this hobby. It's not just a few random men. It's pervasive and it's frustrating. And since it doesn't impact the majority, it's not taken seriously. At the same time, men wonder why so few women are in the board game hobby." Unquote. In the hobby itself, participants report a community plagued by microaggressions, being ignored, talked over, insulted, and interrupted. There's exclusion, harassment, discrimination, even violence. Harassment and abuse at friendly local game stores and conventions have been reported by participants who identify as women or as racialized. Women, non-binary, and racialized gamers have reported unwelcoming and even threatening behavior at game stores, creating a culture that excludes women and BIPOC people. There are other barriers as well. Davis, in 2013, interviewed 57 women who played board games and video games to better understand the factors that prevent women from fully engaging with the hobby. Respondents pointed to a lack of diversity and inclusion in board gaming, identifying that the hobby community needs to include more opportunities for women, racial minorities, and families to participate. Factors such as limited access to childcare, a lack of leisure time, along with a lack of representation in women in board game artwork and playable characters also contributed to women feeling excluded. Outside of the hobby and play spaces that we're looking at in this dissertation, women, LGBTQ+, and BIPOC creators have reported having trouble breaking into the industry itself, finding acceptance when they finally land a role in the board game industry, being paid equally for work of equal value, as well as facing ongoing harassment and abuse. The analog gaming industry, like the digital games industry and other cultural, scientific, and business endeavors, has been plagued by co-opted ideas, stolen designs, and disappeared contributions by women and racialized creators. An infamous example of stolen and co-opted board game design is, of course, the story of Monopoly. Elizabeth Magie designed her Landlord's game to demonstrate the inequities and indignities of life in a society that privileged the landowner. Magie had taken the unusual step at the time of getting a patent on her original design. Nonetheless, it was modified in several key ways, notably by a Quaker family who lived in Atlantic City, and it wasn't until an unemployed Charles Darrow, down on his luck, decided to sell the modified version he stole from his neighbors to Parker Brothers. And that game truly gained popularity at that point. Parker Brothers eventually bought out Magie's patent for a woeful $500, while Darrow raked in millions in revenue. The same kind of challenges persist for women in all levels of game publishing and sales. A sales manager for the popular tabletop wargaming franchise Warhammer 40K recounted her experiences in the industry, saying she was told, quote, "You should just quit, girly girl," unquote, and reporting that she was blacklisted by some game shops whose owners refused to deal with her. Christian Looney, founder of Looney Labs, shared her experiences of being ignored at board game conventions. A former NASA engineer, Looney said her partner has had to correct people, telling them, quote, "Christian runs the company, you need to talk to her," unquote, with Looney herself adding the kicker, quote, "Yes, I am a rocket scientist." Elizabeth Hargrave, designer of Wingspan, said of the employment disparities in the board game hobby and design community, quote, "An analogy to help guys imagine what these stats feel like. The Zumba classes at my gym are usually 100% female. Men come occasionally, but I have never seen a man return. Women and BIPOC in board game design have to be like a man who stubbornly decides to come back to Zumba," unquote. Board game author and content creator Bebo wrote about working in the industry and specifically attending game conventions. Quote, "The board game industry consistently harasses women for checks notes, requesting that all people working in a professional environment adhere to a code of conduct," unquote. harassment accusations at Origins Game Fair in Columbus, Ohio, in 2018 sparked an outcry for a new code of conduct at gaming conventions. The organizer of the conference and fair, the Game Manufacturers Association, GAMA, committed to investigate the claims and committed to adding a victim services staff to its conference planning. Nonetheless, these measures have been criticized as an inadequate response, with some women attending the Origins Game Convention reporting serious issues at the convention despite these measures. A report posted to Twitter noted, quote, "Anyone who says harassment of women isn't an issue in the industry can eat dirt. There's an industry person going around asking women to playtest his erect penis. Another woman was followed for multiple blocks this morning. We need to squash this behavior entirely." These accounts of unwelcoming spaces in the labor of board game development provide us with an early clue as to why the sector might become dominated by certain identities who create games solely for their affinity in-group, that is, people that look and sound and think like them, and that privilege the perspectives, desires, and requirements of those most like themselves. We're going to explore that in more detail in the following podcasts. Thanks for listening. This was episode 5. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm going to be back next week with episode 6, where I'm going to be talking about why board gaming is so important. It has wider issues than just enjoying a game. It has issues for learning and for society. And there are huge, huge stakes when people are excluded from gaming environments and creating that literacy, because it can have wider implications for your career, your life, your understanding of systems. Board gaming is important. So we're going to explore that next week. Stay tuned. Thanks for tuning in. Please click like and subscribe to my channel. It helps a lot. Thank you so much.